Everyone keeps calling it a housing crisis, but a crisis is something unexpected and out of control. What's happening in Australia isn't an accident. It's a direct result of reckless, deliberate policy. And honestly, I've had a bloody gutful. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. There's two monkeys sitting in a bath, and one says, and the other one says, just put some more cold in then. And you might also get a bit hot watching my content, what with me being a try-hard Greek Adonis and all. So sit back, relax, like this video, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I heard this great quote from my uncle who's a plumber, and he said, "There's nothing that sticky tape can't fix." Now, why has the Australian housing market become a complete and utter failure? So new reports out recently show that Australia's house prices are now growing at the fastest rate that they have in 4 years. I mean, what an absolute load of crap. Since COVID, we've seen the most speculative, fear of missing out, demand-driven housing bubble ever, but instead of trying to reduce that speculative demand so that house prices can return to normal balanced market, they're freaking rising by ridiculous levels again. This isn't a normal housing market. Australia's got some of the most expensive houses in the entire world, yet everyone seems to bury their heads in the sand, throw their arms up, and then wonder, gee, how did that freaking happen? How is a city like Sydney just as expensive as Hong Kong, which is a tiny little place with a massive population? I mean, just check out the median house prices across the country. Without considering Darwin and Hobart, which are slightly more affordable, we've got Perth at 980,000, Adelaide at 1,050,000, Melbourne at 1,080,000, Brisbane and Canberra at 1.1 million, and Sydney at a whopping 1.75 million. I mean, just get a load of that crap. This is the median house price, meaning it's absolutely nothing fancy, no freaking mansion, just a small home on a standard block, probably quite a far way out from the CBD. So if you were to use the first home buyer scheme where you only need the 5% deposit, which is $50,000 for a $1 million home, after expenses, your mortgage is going to be around about the $1 million. So you'll end up with mortgage repayments of $6,000 a month or around $1,500 a week just for a standard dog box in Australia's capital cities. But in Australia, everyone's killing themselves for a chance to do just that, and that's because Australia as a country prioritizes building wealth through housing above everything else. Now, this Australian housing disaster really started around the year 2000, but I'm going to focus on the period since COVID because that's what's made me so bloody mad. So when COVID hit, the government didn't just allow the housing market to maybe fall back a bit in prices due to normal market forces. It basically went all out to ensure that house prices didn't fall at all. And in doing so, the actual opposite happened. Property owners were allowed to defer their mortgage repayments. The government provided rent relief payments, which ensured that landlords received their full rental income. People were paid to stay at home. Businesses were paid based on their employees, and the RBA created money out of thin air to buy bonds, which just juiced up the economy. So there was a massive influx of money into the economy, and whenever there's excess money in Australia, it goes into freaking property. So that's bad enough by itself, but then we had interest rates. You see, before COVID, interest rates have been falling consistently in Australia, and they were ultra low, with the cash rate going below 1% prior to COVID. This meant that pretty much all property owners were doing ultra well with interest rates before COVID, but then after COVID, they were dropped to near zero, and then the worst forecast ever in history was made by the RBA. Basically, they said in 2020, after COVID, that interest rates wouldn't rise at all until 2024. So the RBA had dropped the cash rate to 0.15% and then forecast no rate rises for 4 years. Can you imagine what that sort of statement would do to a country like Australia, where property investment is our national religion? One of the most irresponsible, ridiculous statements ever made by a body that's supposed to be well respected and trusted. And not only was the forecast bad, they kept making that same forecast for 12 bloody months. I mean, it's just bewildering. It wasn't long after these policies and statements were made that house prices started to rise at the fastest rate I've ever witnessed. But even with the most hottest and speculative housing markets ever, the RBA kept adding fuel to the fire, and the government did absolutely nothing to try to stop the surge. So all this irresponsible juicing up of the economy and house prices eventually led to the highest levels of inflation Australia has seen in decades. That caused interest rates to surge, which basically obliterated the RBA's forecast. And finally, I thought this artificially inflated house price boom might just be over. And it was for a tiny bit. A few months, everyone got a bit worried and house prices actually started to fall as interest rates rose. But alas, it was short-lived, because around that time, the government completely opened up the borders and turned every migration tap at their disposal. So construction levels had reduced significantly, and then we had a tidal wave of immigration come into the country, and suddenly we're back to mass demand for housing. That small easing of housing demand was over in a flash, and we went back to FOMO and greed. Everyone who doesn't own a property has fear of missing out, that they'll never be able to own one, so they're absolutely desperate to get into the market, whereas those who do own property basically want to see it surge forever to infinity and beyond. And that's pretty much been the state of Australia's housing market since COVID. There's been absolutely no respite for those looking to buy a home and for those who are renting. Through policies completely out of their control, they've basically been left on the financial scrap heap, pushed towards poverty as the wealth gap between property owners and non-property owners becomes more like a chasm. So after pumping mass migration levels for a long period of time, the government said they were taking a major step forward in reforming Australia's broken migration system, going on to say that the new migration strategy will bring migration back to sustainable levels. So the new migration strategy was launched, and a major aspect was bringing migration levels back to normal. This was reiterated by a government spokesman on the Q&A program.
We have been working very hard to get migration levels, immigration levels down to something we think the country can manage.
So once again, I held out a small glimmer of hope that migration levels would significantly reduce, thus easing the overall demand in the housing market. But wouldn't you know, it didn't freaking happen! Just check out what's happening with Australia's permanent and long-term arrivals. There ain't no reduction there, and to explain it a little bit more, here's Alan Kohler from the ABC.
The ABS today put out arrivals and departures data for August, which is not the same as migration, but fairly close and worth watching. Net permanent and long-term arrivals, that is arrivals minus departures, totalled 31,450 for the month, 32% more than last August. For the first 8 months of the year, 379,850 more people arrived permanently than left, a rise of 6.4% over the same period last year. So I think we can confidently say that immigration has stopped declining.
If you looked at all this, you'd probably think to yourself, there's no way Australia could add any more speculative demand to housing. But if you did think that, you'd be wrong. In October 2025, the first home buyer's guarantee was expanded, so there was no limit on who could apply, and the caps on how expensive the home was significantly lifted. So here's another scheme which just juiced up housing demand even further. And wouldn't you know, as soon as this scheme was announced, house prices started rising, in some places over 100,000. So on the one hand, we'll help you buy your first home with a smaller deposit, but on the other hand, you'll have to pay another 100 or 200,000 for the actual home. What an absolute disgrace. You know, when you look at a massive bodybuilder and you just know they're taking a huge cycle of steroids, well, the Australian housing market is way more juiced up than that. There were so many times since COVID that I thought, finally, maybe now they might reduce demand, but every single time I was wrong. Yes, I get it that property owners love seeing their house prices rise, but I also understand that when you have millions of Australians completely locked out of the housing market, you've broken the social contract with them because they can't even afford a small piece of Australia to be able to call their own. And when that starts happening to more and more people, society starts to unravel. And we're definitely starting to see that, but sadly it looks like it's gonna get worse. I've had a gutful of hearing that improving the housing market is the #1 priority, especially when the actual opposite always seems to happen. The Australian housing market is completely broken and unfair, massively favouring those who already own property whilst basically sacrificing everyone else. I think Morgan Cox was 100% correct when he asked this question on Australian TV.
I want to know, is the government going to cut immigration to match housing availability, or are we just going to keep going until every regular working Australian is homeless?
Enough said. I'm Biko Konstantinos.